The town of Redemption huddled in the valley like a sinner seeking absolution, its dusty main street a scar across the landscape. Jake guided the wagon past the saloon, and the scent of stale beer and regret already seeping from its swinging doors, even in the mid-morning sun. He had a list from Sarah folded in his pocket, flour salt coffee, and a small bag of horehound candy for Emma. A simple trip for simple things. It was a life he was still getting used to, a quiet rhythm of need and provision that felt more real than anything he had known before. He was tying the horses to the hitching post in front of the general store when the first gunshot cracked the air. It was sharp, definitive, followed by the percussive shatter of the bank's front window across the street. People screamed. The placid morning erupted into chaos. Men and women scrambled for cover, dragging children behind them. Horses reared in their harnesses, their eyes wide with panic. Jake's reaction was instinctual, a relic from a life he fought daily to forget. He didn't run. He melted back against the wagon, his hand automatically dropping to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, his eyes scanning, assessing. 4 riders, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, were backing out of the bank canvas sacks slung over their shoulders. They moved with a brutal efficiency that spoke of long practice. Their leader, a tall man with a swaggering confidence, barked orders as his men mounted up. He was the last to swing into his saddle, turning to fire a final intimidating shot into the sky. In that moment, as the bandana slipped just an inch below his chin, Jake saw the cruel line of his mouth, the jagged scar that cut through his left eyebrow. A ghost, a memory given flesh and fury. Caleb. The name hit Jake with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. It couldn't be. Caleb was dead. Dead and buried in the unmarked grave Jake himself had helped dig 10 years ago. As the outlaws spurred their horses down the street, kicking up a storm of dust and fear, Caleb glanced back. His eyes, cold and familiar, swept over the chaos. He didn't see Jake, but in his haste, his gloved hand fumbled with a chain around his neck. Something small and silver glinted in the harsh sunlight before falling unnoticed into the thick dust of the street. The riders thundered out of town, leaving behind a ringing silence, punctuated by a woman's sobbing. Jake remained frozen, his world tilting on its axis. The sight of Caleb Vance, a man he had left for dead, was impossible enough. But it was the glint of silver in the dust that held him captive. He waited until the first brave townsfolk began to emerge from their hiding places before he moved. He walked slowly, deliberately, into the center of the street, his gaze fixed on the spot where the object had fallen. He knelt, his fingers brushing away the fine reddish dirt. There, nestled in the dust, was a silver locket. It was small and oval, tarnished with age, its surface etched with a delicate 5-petaled flower. He didn't need to open it. He knew the impossible truth of it in the marrow of his bones. His thumb traced the familiar pattern, a motion repeated 1,000 times in a forgotten life. He had given this locket to his wife Maria on the day their daughter was born. The flower was a bluebonnet, her favorite. He pried it open with a trembling thumb. The tiny portraits were faded but still achingly clear. On one side Maria, her dark eyes full of a light he had extinguished forever. On the other, his daughter Lily, a smiling 2-year-old child captured in a moment of pure, innocent joy. The fever had taken them both, the doctor had said. A cruel, random act of fate. But this locket here in the dirt of Redemption, dropped by the ghost of a dead man, told a different story. It was a story that had followed him, silent and patient, and had just announced its violent return. The simple trip for flour and coffee was over. The past had just kicked down his door. The scent of pine on a wind that carried the chill of distant peaks was the first thing that always greeted Jake on his return. a clean, sharp perfume that scoured the dust of the world from his lungs. As the wagon crested the final rise, the homestead came into view, nestled in its small valley, like a secret. Smoke curled from the stone chimney of the cabin, a soft gray plume against the impossible blue of the sky. It was a picture of peace, a fragile masterpiece he had stumbled into, and now guarded with the ferocity of a man who knew what it was to have nothing. Sarah was in the yard, hanging laundry on a line, stretched between two tall pines. Emma was on a blanket at her feet, a chubby, gurgling bundle of joy, reaching for the dancing shadows of the clothespins. Sarah looked up as he approached, a smile illuminating her face, and the cold knot of dread in Jake's stomach loosened just for a moment. This was his world now. This was the life he had built from the ashes of the old one. He had arrived 6 months ago, a drifter answering an advertisement for a hired hand, carrying nothing but a saddlebag, and the ghosts that rode with him. He had found a young widow struggling to hold on to her land, a baby in her arms, and a quiet desperation in her eyes. He'd intended to stay only through the harvest to earn a stake and move on as he always did. But then there was Emma with her wide, trusting eyes. And there was Sarah with her resilience and her gentle strength. They hadn't asked for his secrets. They had simply offered him a place, a home. He reined in the horses and swung down from the wagon, forcing a smile. "Got everything on your list?" he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, her gaze full of a warm concern that he felt he didn't deserve. "You were gone a long time. Is everything all right?" He couldn't tell her. Not yet. To speak of Caleb of the locket would be to invite the shadows of his past into this sunlit space, and he would do anything to protect it. Just a long line at the mercantile, he lied the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He busied himself unhitching the team, his movements economical and sure. He worked with a quiet competence, mending a fence with calloused, steady hands that knew the language of wood and wire, calming a nervous horse with a low murmur. These were the rhythms of his new life, of the honest labor that kept the ghosts at bay. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch carving small wooden animals for Emma, the shavings falling around his boots as he transformed a block of pine into a bird or a bear. Sarah came and stood beside him, handing him a cup of coffee. Emma, now in her arms, reached for him, her face breaking into a delighted, toothless grin. Jake took the baby, settling her against his broad chest. Her small head fit perfectly in the hollow of his shoulder. He closed his eyes, inhaling the sweet, milky scent of her, a scent of life and promise. This was what was real. A man, a woman, a child. A family forged not by blood, but by choice. "You're quiet tonight," Sarah observed, her voice soft. He looked at her, at the strength in her clear blue eyes, the kindness in the gentle curve of her mouth. He had fallen in love with her slowly then, all at once. It wasn't a passionate, reckless love like the one he had known with Maria. This was quieter, deeper, a love built on shared work, mutual respect, and the quiet miracle of raising a child together. "Just thinking," he said. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to confess the sins of his past, to lay the burden down and trust her to help him carry it. But fear held him back. The man she knew was Jake, the quiet homesteader. She didn't know Jacob Thorne, the outlaw who had ridden with the Vance gang, a man whose choices had led to ruin and death. To tell her would be to risk losing this fragile piece, to see fear replace the love in her eyes. So he held his silence, and the locket a cold, heavy weight in his pocket, a constant reminder of the storm gathering just beyond their peaceful valley. The storm broke 2 days later, not with thunder and lightning, but with the arrival of a lone rider on a fine-looking sorrel. He wasn't a drifter or a neighbor. He wore a crisp suit and a city hat, and he carried a leather satchel. He dismounted with an air of officious purpose, his eyes taking in the humble cabin with a faint, dismissive sneer. "I'm looking for a Mrs. Sarah Morrison," he announced, his voice clipped and precise. Sarah stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Jake moved to stand beside her, his presence a silent wall. The man pulled a thick envelope from his satchel. "I am an agent for the law firm of Vance and Sterling. I have been instructed to deliver this correspondence." He handed the envelope to Sarah, and without another word tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away. Sarah's hands trembled as she broke the seal. Jake watched her face, saw her eyes scan the elegant script, saw the color drain from her cheeks. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and terror. "What is it?" he asked, though a cold certainty was already forming in his gut. Her voice was a choked whisper. "It's a letter, a legal notice, from a man named Elias Vance." The name struck Jake like a hammer blow. Elias, the older brother, the respectable one, the businessman who had publicly disowned Caleb but secretly funded his operations. "Who is this man?" Sarah's voice rose with panic, her hand clutching his arm. "Why would a stranger want our Emma? It says he's petitioning the court for custody. It says he can provide for her, that he has a claim." Jake took the letter, his own eyes scanning the cold, legalistic words. It was all there. A petition filed with the territorial court citing Elias Vance's distant familial connection to Sarah's late husband and his immense wealth as reasons he would be a more suitable guardian. It was a lie, a fabrication, but one wrapped in the unassailable authority of the law. He knew with sickening certainty that this had nothing to do with Emma's welfare. It was about him. It was Caleb's revenge from beyond the grave, orchestrated by his powerful brother. Sarah was looking at him, her eyes pleading for an explanation he couldn't give. "Who is he?" she asked again. Jake looked away from her, his gaze settling on the distant, unforgiving peaks. He couldn't hide anymore. The past hadn't just knocked on his door, it had kicked it in. "He's no stranger to me." Jake said, his voice a low, grim rumble. "He's a ghost." The first shot in Elias Vance's war was not fired with a gun. It was delivered by the newly appointed Sheriff of Redemption, a man named Briggs. He arrived alone a week later, not with the swagger of a lawman confident in his authority, but with the strutting arrogance of a man who has been bought and paid for. He was young, with a prematurely receding hairline and pale, resentful eyes that seemed to begrudge Jake the very air he breathed. "Morrison," Briggs said, dismounting and hitching his horse with a theatrical flourish. He didn't address Sarah at all. "Got a court order for you." He held out the paper, a smug curl to his lips. Jake took it, but didn't look at it. He kept his eyes on the sheriff, his posture relaxed, but coiled like a wolf watching a coyote. "It's a preliminary order," Briggs continued, enjoying his moment. "Says you're to surrender the child, Emma Morrison, into my custody pending a full hearing. Mr. Vance has expressed concerns for the girl's welfare in this rustic environment." He gestured dismissively at the clean, well-tended homestead. Sarah stepped forward, her fear from the past week hardening into a cold, protective fury. On what grounds, Sheriff, what possible concern could he have? Briggs finally deigned to look at her. "The law doesn't require Mr. Vance to explain himself to you, ma'am. It only requires you to comply. This is our home." Sarah said, her voice steady and clear, betraying none of the panic Jake knew was churning inside her. "We are her legal parents. My late husband's family has never shown an ounce of interest in her before. This is a malicious claim, and we will not subject our daughter to it." She was smarter than Briggs gave her credit for, using the language of the law he so clearly worshipped. Jake remained silent, a tactic he had learned long ago. Let the loud men talk themselves into corners. His stillness was a counterpoint to the sheriff's bluster, a quiet, intense presence that was its own kind of threat. He watched Briggs, noted the way the sheriff's hand hovered near his pistol, a nervous, reflexive gesture. The man was a bully, not a fighter. Briggs's face reddened. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by a woman. I have a court order, Morrison. That means I have the authority. Don't make me use it. You're on my land, Sheriff, Jake said, his voice low and even. It was the first time he had spoken, and the sound of it made Briggs flinch. And you're upsetting my wife and child. The order says, pending a hearing. We'll be at that hearing. Until then, you have no business here. I could arrest you for obstruction, Briggs blustered. You could try, Jake said. The words were not a challenge, but a simple statement of fact. A chasm of possibility opened in the space between them. The sheriff hesitated. He had come alone expecting an easy victory, a simple matter of intimidating a mountain farmer and a grieving widow. He had not expected calm resistance, legal arguments, and the unwavering gaze of a man who looked like he had been to hell and back and was not impressed by a tin star. Frustrated, Briggs snatched the court order from Jake's hand. Fine, have it your way. But don't think this is over. I'll be back. And when I return, I'll have enough men to tear this place apart, board by board, if I have to. He spun on his heel, untied his horse with angry, jerky movements, and mounted up. The hearing is in Silver Creek in 2 weeks, he shouted over his shoulder as he rode off. Be there, or I'll come for you. They watched until he was a small dot, disappearing down the trail. The ticking clock had started. Sarah sagged against the porch railing, the fight going out of her. 2 weeks, she whispered. What are we going to do? Jake put his arm around her. We fight, he said, but not here, and not with guns. Not yet. He knew he couldn't win this battle waiting for it to come to him. He had to ride into the heart of it. I need to go to Silver Creek. I need to see a lawyer. And I need to find out everything I can about what Elias Vance has become. Leaving her and Emma was the last thing he wanted to do, but it was the only way. He had to understand the ghost he was fighting. The journey to Silver Creek was a descent into a world Jake had abandoned. The territorial capital was a bustling, chaotic hub of commerce and corruption, a place where fortunes were made and lives were broken with equal speed. Men in fine suits hurried along boardwalks, their faces set with ambition, while grizzled prospectors with desperation in their eyes traded rumors of new gold strikes. It was a city built on greed, the perfect kingdom for a man like Elias Vance. Leaving Sarah had been the hardest part. She had stood in the doorway, her face pale but resolute, Emma clutched in her arms. Be careful, she had whispered, and in those 2 words he had heard all her fear and all her love. He had promised to return in a week, a promise that felt fragile and uncertain. His first stop was a lawyer, a man named Abernathy, whose dusty office smelled of aging paper and stale tobacco. Abernathy listened to Jake's story, his fingers steepled, his expression growing more grim with each detail. It's a tough case, Mr. Morrison, he said, leaning back in his creaking chair. Elias Vance is one of the most powerful men in this territory. He has judges in his pocket and the governor on his payroll. On paper, his claim is plausible. He can offer the child financial security, education opportunities you cannot. A judge will look at that very favorably. What about love? Jake asked, the words feeling foolish and hollow in this cynical room. What about the fact that we're her family? Abernathy gave him a pitying look. The law, I'm afraid, is a cold instrument. It deals in facts and precedents, not emotions. Our best hope is to delay to prove that removing the child would cause her undue harm. Jake left the office with a knot of ice in his stomach. The law was not on their side. He needed another weapon. He needed information. That led him to the Silver Dollar Saloon, a place where whispers were traded like currency. He was looking for a man named Silas Croft, a former territorial marshal who had retired into a bottle of whiskey after seeing too much of the world's ugliness. Silas had been the one to investigate the Black Creek payroll heist all those years ago. He found Silas in a dark corner nursing a glass of amber liquid. The man's face was a roadmap of disappointment, but his eyes were still sharp, missing nothing. Jacob Thorne Silas said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I heard you were dead." "Close enough," Jake replied, sliding into the chair opposite him. "I go by Jake Morrison now." "A new name won't wash away the old sins," Silas observed, taking a slow sip of his drink. "What do you want, Thorne?" "Information about Elias Vance." Silas let out a harsh, dry laugh. "Getting ambitious in your old age, Elias Vance owns this town. He's a spider in the center of a very large web. He's buying up landmines, railroads, anything that can be bought. He's ruthless, but he does it all from behind a desk with lawyers and contracts. He's what they call a respectable monster." "What about his brother Caleb?" The old lawman's eyes narrowed. Caleb was the black sheep, a violent, reckless fool. Elias publicly disowned him, but I always suspected he was the one pulling the strings, using his brother to do the dirty work. He was too clean to touch himself. Why the sudden interest? "Elias is trying to take my daughter." The words hung in the stale air. Silas stared at him, his gaze penetrating. "Your daughter, I thought your wife and child." "I have a new life, Silas, a new family. Elias is using the law to destroy it." While Jake navigated the treacherous currents of Silver Creek, Sarah was fighting her own war back at the homestead. The day after Jake left, she found the fence to the north pasture cut their small herd of cattle scattered across the mountainside. It took her an entire day to round them up, her body aching, her mind filled with a cold fury. This was Vance's work, a message. 2 days later, the small irrigation ditch that fed their garden was dammed upstream. The water diverted. The young plants began to wilt in the sun. She spent hours with a shovel clearing the rocks and mud, her hands blistering, her resolve hardening with every scoop of earth. They were trying to break her to prove she was an unfit mother, unable to manage on her own. But they had underestimated her. She was not just a widow. She was a survivor. Every act of harassment only fueled her determination. She slept with a rifle by her bed, starting at every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig in the woods. She was alone, but she was not helpless. She was a mother protecting her child, and there was no force on earth more formidable. The midpoint of Jake's self-imposed deadline came and went. He spent his days gathering whispers, piecing together the last decade of Elias Vance's life. The picture that emerged was of a man obsessed with power and legacy, a man who saw the world as a collection of assets to be acquired. But there was still a piece missing. The why. Why, after all these years, was Elias coming after him now? The answer came during his second meeting with Silas. Jake had bought a bottle, and the old lawman was in a more reflective, talkative mood. "The Black Creek heist," Silas said, staring into his glass as if the past were reflected there. It was supposed to be Caleb's masterpiece, but it went wrong. Someone tipped off the marshals. It was a bloodbath. He looked up, his sharp eyes pinning Jake to his chair. "You were there." "I was," Jake admitted, the memory still raw. The smell of gunpowder, the screams of dying men. I was the one who got away." "And Caleb didn't," Silas finished. "He took a bullet in the gut. Died slow. The story I heard was that his own partner shot him in the back and took off with the money." Jake felt the blood drain from his face. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Silas shrugged. "It's the story Elias Vance tells himself. The one he's been nursing like a grievance for 10 years. He never forgave his brother for dying, but he hates the man he thinks killed him even more." Suddenly, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The custody claim, the legal maneuvering, it was never about Emma. It was a trap, a perfectly legal and socially acceptable way to draw Jake out of the shadows and destroy him piece by piece. Elias didn't want the child. He wanted revenge. He wanted to take from Jake the one thing that mattered, to make him suffer the same loss that he believed Jake had inflicted upon his family. "He doesn't want to raise her," Jake said, the realization dawning on him like a black sun. "He wants to erase her. He wants to take her from me, put her in some Eastern orphanage, and wipe my new life off the face of the earth." The law was not a shield. It was Vance's chosen weapon. He could not win in a courtroom against a man who owned the judge. He couldn't hide because Vance had already found him. The only way to win this war was to confront the ghost himself. The stakes had just changed. This was no longer about losing Emma. It was about losing everything, including his own life, in a battle against a man who would stop at nothing to settle a decade-old score. The ride home was a desperate race against time, fueled by coffee and cold dread. Every mile that separated him from Sarah and Emma felt like a physical chasm. He pushed his horse to its limit, the rhythmic pounding of its hooves a frantic drumbeat, counting down the seconds until Vance's next move. He arrived to find the homestead unnervingly quiet. His heart hammered against his ribs as he slid from the saddle, his rifle in his hand. He found Sarah in the barn, her face smudged with dirt, her knuckles bruised. She was reinforcing the door with a heavy wooden beam. "They came back," she said, her voice flat and exhausted. "Not Briggs, just 2 men. They didn't try to get in. They just watched. From the ridge, all day yesterday." He pulled her into his arms, relief washing over him so intensely it left him weak. She was safe. Emma was safe. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and Sarah. That night, after Emma was asleep in her cradle, he told her everything. He sat at the small kitchen table and unburdened himself of the secrets he had carried for a decade. He told her about Jacob Thorne, about the Vance gang, about the robberies and the running. He told her about the Black Creek heist, how it had all gone wrong, how he had watched Caleb die, and how he had used that bloody end as his chance to escape the life. Sarah listened in silence, her expression unreadable in the flickering lamplight. When he was finished, the silence in the cabin was heavy, suffocating. "So this man, Elias Vance," she said finally, her voice dangerously quiet, "he thinks you murdered his brother." "Yes. And this whole thing with Emma, it's all just revenge?" "Yes." She stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the blackness. "You lied to me, Jake. Every day you were here, you lied to me." The words were not an accusation, but a statement of fact, and they cut him deeper than any bullet could have. "I was afraid," he said, his voice raw. "Afraid if you knew what I was, you wouldn't want me." She turned to face him, and now he could see the hurt in her eyes, mingled with a terrifying anger. "What I wanted was a husband, a partner, not a ghost with a past so dark it threatens to swallow our daughter whole. Did you think it would just stay buried forever? Did you think you could just walk away and it wouldn't follow you?" I hoped, he admitted, his head bowed in shame. "For you, for Emma. I hoped I could build something clean." "There's nothing clean about a life built on a lie," she shot back. The gulf between them felt vast, uncrossable. He had brought this danger to her door, shattered the peace she had fought so hard to find. He had no defense, no excuse. He could only offer the truth. "I love you, Sarah, and I love that little girl more than my own life. Everything I did to protect what we have." "Protect it." Her laugh was bitter. "You've put a target on it." They stood in a standoff, the future of their family hanging by a thread. But as Emma stirred in her cradle, making a soft, sleepy sound, something shifted in Sarah's expression. Her gaze softened, the anger receding to reveal the fierce, protective love beneath. She looked from the cradle back to Jake. "We are in this together," she said, her voice no longer angry, but filled with a steely resolve. "Your past is our problem now. But no more secrets, Jake. From this moment on, no more lies." He crossed the room and took her hands. They were rough and calloused from her work, and they were the strongest, most beautiful hands he had ever known. "I promise," he said, and it was the most sacred vow he had ever made. Their reconciliation was forged in the fire of shared danger. They were no longer just a couple in love. They were partners in a war. But Vance was escalating. A few days later, a rider from Redemption brought word that Sheriff Briggs was deputizing men forming a posse. The story being spread through town was that a dangerous outlaw, Jacob Thorne, was holding a widow and her child hostage in the mountains. Vance wasn't just isolating them physically. He was turning their entire community against them. They were utterly alone. To make matters worse, Briggs had a new right-hand man. A notorious gunslinger known as Silas Blackwood, a man who hired his gun out to the highest bidder, and whose conscience was as empty as his holster after a fight. Elias Vance was no longer content to use the law. He was now prepared to enforce his vendetta with blood. The second obstacle was no longer just a legal document or a corrupt sheriff. It was an armed force sanctioned by the law and fueled by lies, preparing to march on their home. The first drops of rain began to fall, just after dawn, cold and hard against the cabin roof. By noon, it was a deluge. A violent thunderstorm rolled down from the peaks, turning the world outside into a churning chaos of wind, water, and flickering light. It was the perfect cover. They came as the storm reached its peak. The posse led by Briggs and the cold-eyed Blackwood didn't ride directly for the cabin. Instead, they used the terrain flanking them, their intent clear to surround and overwhelm. "They're trying to pin us in," Jake said, watching from the window. "Force a siege." "Then we don't let them," Sarah replied, her face grim as she checked the load in her rifle. They had a plan conceived during the tense days of waiting. They wouldn't make their stand at the cabin a wooden box that could easily become a trap. Their destination was the old, abandoned church that stood on a rise a mile away. It was built of stone with narrow windows and a clear field of fire in all directions. It was defensible. They slipped out the back, moving through the storm-lashed woods like specters. Emma was strapped to Sarah's chest in a sling bundled against the rain, sleeping through the tempest. They reached the church just as the posse closed in on the empty cabin, the sound of splintering wood carrying faintly on the wind. Inside the church smelled of damp stone and decay. Rain lashed through holes in the roof and thunder rattled the tall arched windows. They took up positions, Jake by the main door, Sarah by a side window that overlooked the trail. It didn't take long for the posse to realize they'd been duped. They came charging toward the church, their caution thrown to the wind. A rifle cracked from the trees, Blackwood firing a ranging shot that chipped stone near the doorway. "They want to draw our fire, see how many we are," Jake murmured. Then a new figure emerged from the tree line, walking slowly toward the church. He was not armed like the others. He wore a fine city coat now soaked with rain, and he moved with an air of absolute authority. Elias Vance. Jacob Thorne. Vance's voice cut through the roar of the storm. It's been a long time. I've come for what you owe me. Jake stepped into the doorway, shielding his eyes from the driving rain. This has nothing to do with the child Elias. This is between you and me. Everything has to do with the child, Vance screamed, his composure finally cracking, revealing the raw hatred beneath. You took my brother, my blood. I'm going to take yours. Not just the one you have now. I'm going to desecrate the memory of the ones you lost. A bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating Vance's face, contorted with a grief so profound it had curdled into madness. And in that flash of white light, he delivered the blow that shattered Jake's world. You think a fever took them, don't you? You pathetic fool. You ran from Black Creek and left a trail of blood. My brother, mad with grief and rage, went looking for you. He went to your little homestead looking for his share, looking for you. But you weren't there. The world narrowed to the space between Jake and Vance. The rain, the thunder, the posse, it all faded away. You're Maria. She tried to stop him. Vance spat the words like venom. She stood in his way. There was a struggle, a shot. She was just in the way. And your little girl, your Lily, she saw it all. She started screaming. He paused, savoring the moment, twisting the knife. Caleb never could stand a screaming child. There was another shot. He killed them, Jacob. He killed them because of you. He murdered your family in a fit of rage, and you've spent 10 years running from a lie. The foundation of Jake's life, the grief he had carried, the redemption he had sought, it all crumbled into dust. He wasn't just a man whose choices had indirectly led to tragedy. He was the cause. His sins hadn't just created consequences. They had loaded the gun that killed his wife and child. A wave of pure black rage washed over him, so powerful it threatened to drown him. He wanted to kill Elias Vance. He wanted to kill every man with him. He wanted to become the monster they all believed him to be. But then he heard it. A small, soft whimper from behind him. Emma was awake, frightened by the shouting. Sarah was murmuring to her a low, soothing sound. He looked back at them, at his wife, his daughter, his future. And he was faced with a profound moral choice. He could surrender to the rage, seek a bloody revenge, and lose his soul and this new family in the process. Or he could defeat Vance without becoming him. He turned back, his face a mask of cold fury, but his mind clear. He raised his rifle, but not at Vance. He fired twice in quick succession. The first shot struck the rope, holding the church's heavy bronze bell, sending it crashing down to block the main entrance. The second shattered a rotten support beam above the posse, causing a section of the porch roof to collapse, scattering the men. Chaos erupted. In the confusion, he moved. He used his knowledge of the terrain of the storm, of the church's weaknesses, to outsmart and disarm them. It wasn't a shootout. It was a tactical dismantling. He led them through the graveyard, using the tombstones for cover, picking them off one by one, not with bullets, but with precise disabling shots and brutal, non-lethal force. Finally, it was just him and Vance facing each other in the mud and the driving rain. Vance stripped of his power, and his men lunged at him with a primal scream. Their fight was not one of skill, but of raw physical hatred. They crashed through the cemetery fence, trading desperate, clumsy blows. It ended with Jake's hands around Vance's throat, his thumbs pressing down the man's life, flickering beneath his grip. He could end it. He could have his revenge. He looked into Vance's terrified, hate-filled eyes, and he saw nothing but a broken man consumed by the same grief that had almost consumed him. He thought of Lily. He thought of Emma. And he made his choice. He loosened his grip, hauled the sputtering Vance to his feet, and slammed him against a tombstone. "It's over, Elias," he said, his voice ragged. He would not kill him for revenge. He would subdue him for the law, for the future, for the man Sarah and Emma needed him to be. As the rain began to subside, a new group of riders appeared on the ridge. They were not part of the posse. They wore the uniforms of the U.S. Marshals. The lead marshal, a grim-faced veteran, dismounted and surveyed the scene, the scattered and disarmed posse, the wreckage of the church porch, and Jake holding a defeated Elias Vance. "We've been tracking Mr. Vance on suspicion of fraud and racketeering for months," the marshal said, his voice calm and authoritative. "Looks like we found him in the middle of something else entirely." He had heard Vance's crazed public confession. He had witnessed the entire climax from the tree line. Vance Blackwood and the more aggressive members of the posse were taken into custody. The federal marshal officially took charge, his authority superseding any local jurisdiction. He looked at the court order Briggs stammered to produce, then tore it in half. This document was procured under false pretenses as part of a personal vendetta. It is null and void. Sheriff Briggs, exposed as a corrupt pawn and a coward, was stripped of his badge on the spot, left to face the humiliation of a town he had tried to manipulate. The threat at last was truly gone. The journey back to the cabin was made in a strange, dreamlike silence. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine. The world looked new, reborn. They found the cabin door broken, the interior ransacked. But it didn't matter. They were together. They were safe. That night by the fire, with Emma sleeping soundly, Jake finally told Sarah the complete, terrible truth of how Maria and Lily had died. He spared no detail, his voice breaking, as he recounted the horror Vance had revealed. He expected to see horror or revulsion in her eyes. Instead, he saw only a profound, heartbreaking compassion. She came to him, knelt before his chair, and took his hands in hers. "That was not your fault, Jake," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "That was the fault of a violent, broken man. Your only crime was trying to escape a life that was killing you. You have carried a guilt that was never yours to bear." Tears he hadn't known he was holding back streamed down his face. He wept for the family he had lost, for the truth he had never known, and for the grace he had just been given. Sarah held him, her quiet strength, a rock in the storm of his grief. In her forgiveness, he found his own. Their love, tested by secrets and violence, was reaffirmed stronger and truer than before. Weeks passed. The rhythm of life returned slower and more precious than before. The broken door was mended, the garden replanted. The laughter of a child once again filled the small cabin, a sound of pure, untarnished hope. The territory buzzed with the news of Elias Vance's arrest and the vast criminal enterprise he had commanded. But for the family in the small mountain valley, it was just a distant echo. One crisp, clear afternoon, Jake found himself in his small workshop at the edge of the woods. He was organizing old tools when his hand brushed against a small, dusty wooden chest tucked away under the workbench. He hadn't opened it in years. With a sense of quiet reverence, he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst a few faded letters and a tarnished silver dollar, was a small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was half finished. He remembered the day he had started it, sitting on the porch of another cabin in another life, the sound of his 2-year-old daughter's laughter in the background. He had been carving it for Lily. He had never finished it. He picked it up, his large, calloused hands, impossibly gentle. He ran his thumb over the smooth, sanded wood, feeling the ghost of a promise he had been unable to keep. He sat down on a stool, took out his favorite whittling knife, and with slow, deliberate strokes, he began to finish what he had started a decade ago. When it was done, he held it in his palm, a perfect tiny bluebird, its wings poised for flight. Then he picked up a fresh block of pine. He began to carve again, his hands, moving with a fluid grace born of long practice. He carved another bird similar to the first, but different. Stronger in the wings, its head tilted with a look of curious optimism. A bird for Emma. He walked into the cabin. Sarah was by the fire, humming softly as she rocked Emma to sleep. She looked up as he entered, her eyes questioning. He said nothing. He walked to the stone mantelpiece, the heart of their home. On one side sat a photograph of Sarah and her first husband, Tom. On the other, a small clay horse Emma had made with her mother. Jake reached up and placed the two wooden birds on the mantel side by side. The ghost of his past and the promise of his future together. He was no longer a man of two separate lives, one to be hidden and the other to be protected. He was whole. A husband and a father, scarred but not broken, redeemed not by forgetting, but by finally having the courage to remember and to build anew. Sarah came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. She looked at the two birds, and she understood. Their family was not just safe, it was healed.